And one of the reasons, by the way, why in the book Dune, I stop it the way I do. I've chopped it at a non-breaking point so that the person reading the story skids out of the story, trailing bits of it with him.
Despite being a critical and commercial hit, Dune Part 2 has been criticized by some fans for being a, quote, unfaithful adaptation of its source novel. One example is the movie's different interpretation of the character Chani and its subsequently different ending. But I couldn't disagree more. As backwards as it might sound, I'm convinced that in order to faithfully adapt its novel, Dune's ending needed to change. If you haven't read 1965's Dune by Frank Herbert, much of its ending is similar to the movie. Despite Paul Atreides finally conquering his enemies and becoming the ruler of Arrakis, there's a sense of sorrow as he, quote, realizes the inevitability of the jihad and his own futility to stop it.
Lead them to paradise.
Just like the movie, Paul then proposes marriage to Princess Irulan. But here's where things change. Where the movie ends with Chani feeling betrayed by Paul, book Chani is extremely chill about everything. To the point where she reassures Paul that, quote, there's nothing binding between us, before asking if Paul wants her to scram. It actually works in the novel. All of these pieces feel sudden and surprising and achieves Herbert's goal of ending his book at a jarring cliffhanger. But Dune fan and director Denis Villeneuve will tell you that what works on the page does not always work on the screen.
When you do an adaptation, it's a very violent process. There's a brutal moment when you need to destroy the original.
One of the ways Denis had to destroy the novel was through the process of dividing its story into two separate movies. Because of that division, Paul's struggle against the Harkonnens becomes the primary conflict these movies hinge around. Denis understood that if Dune Part 2 ended with Paul curb-stomping the Baron, the Emperor, and Feyd-Rautha, sitting atop a throne while embracing the love of his life, it would feel more like this kind of ending instead of this kind of ending.
I am your father.
I'm sure I don't need to tell you, but the ending of the middle movie in a trilogy is known for its cliffhangers. It's the moment where Luke Skywalker literally hangs onto a cliff. It's where Ian McKellen stares at a volcano and says shit like,
"The battle for Helm's Deep is over. The battle for Middle-earth is about to begin."
And this kind of cliffhanger is exactly what Herbert wanted the ending of Dune to feel like.
So that the person reading the story skids out of the story, trailing bits of it with him.
If Dune Part 2 had ended more literally faithful to the events in its book, it never would have had this effect. What the Dune films paradoxically needed was a director who would prioritize faithfulness to the author's intentions over faithfulness to the author's text, which is exactly what Denis Villeneuve says he attempted to do.
I did my adaptation not trying to be faithful. I was not trying to be faithful to the book, but more faithful to Frank Herbert's initial desires. So in order to do so, the big difference, I will say, is the character of Chani.
Paul and Chani's relationship sits at the core of both films. It precedes Paul's interactions with the Harkonnens, his family, even Arrakis. It's quite literally the first thing we're introduced to in Dune Part 1. Denis identified that there would be no greater way to convey Paul's sense of a Pyrrhic victory than by ending the film at the destruction of their relationship, or, in the words of the author, chopping their story at a
non-breaking point.
This change adds a layer of believable complexity to Chani while also making me excited to see what will happen in Dune Part 3. My mind is already running with possibilities, which is exactly the effect Herbert wanted his audience to feel after finishing the novel.
Now, we all have stories that we go on with after finishing reading them. We went on and told the story ourselves.
Yeah.
I want the person to go on and construct for himself all of these marvelous flights of fantasy and imagination. Now, I deliberately did this in Dune for that purpose.
Aside from whether or not the movie accurately adapts its novel, this quote from Herbert establishes that, on a meaningful level, being faithful to Dune is less about adhering to one specific interpretation than it is about actively participating in constructing the story for yourself. And I'm always skeptical when my favorite books are adapted into films. It often feels like corporations literally trying to buy my love. And so I get it if you don't agree with Denis' own flights of imagination, but speaking for myself, he has at least one believer.